That's me or not. So wonderful to see all of you here today. So wonderful to see all of you here today. I sense a kind of excitement in the air. I don't know if it has anything to do with what happened over the last 24 hours, but I suspect it does. Really exciting times right now. I want to thank you and welcome you to this symposium. I have a few words that I want to read. I hope you don't mind, but we're incredibly excited about your presence here, and I think we're going to have a really wonderful conversation. Good evening. My name is Tope Falarin, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Policy Studies. On behalf of our co-hosts tonight, the Wallace Global Fund, The Nation magazine, and big shout out to Busboys and Poets. I am so pleased to welcome you to the inaugural Henry A. Wallace Symposium. I am excited to welcome those of you here in the audience, including members of the Wallace family, and hundreds of you online as well. We are gathering at a crucial moment for American democracy. One has only to take a quick glance at the headlines to understand what the stakes are for all of us, and the work we must do to counteract a rising tide of fascism that has been building in both the United States and abroad. This troubling trend has captured the attention of political analysts, social movements, historians, and concerned citizens alike as we observe the emergence of leaders with authoritarian tendencies, a shift in political rhetoric, and the erosion of our democratic norms. The resurgence of fascist ideas in our nation can be traced to several factors: economic disparity, cultural tensions, and a perceived loss of national identity have fueled a populist movement, tapping into widespread discontent. This movement is marked by a strong centralized ideology that emphasizes nationalism, often coupled with xenophobia and a rejection of pluralism. We've also seen attempts to delegitimize electoral processes, disregard for the rule of law, and efforts to weaken the checks and balances that are fundamental to our democracy. The judiciary, once considered an impartial arbiter, has been increasingly politicized, leading to legitimate concerns about its independence and ability to uphold the Constitution. But what exactly is fascism? At IPS, as we have worked to diagnose and respond to this moment, we've been spending a great deal of time reading the words of Henry A. Wallace, who was in many ways the inspiration for this event, and the fellowship program at IPS that bears his name. In 1944, the New York Times asked Henry Wallace, who was then serving as Franklin Delano Roosevelt's vice president, to describe the various aspects of fascism. Wallace wrote, quote, "A fascist is one whose lust for money or power is combined with such an intensity of intolerance towards those of other races, parties, classes, religions, cultures, regions, or nations as to make him ruthless in his use of deceit or violence to attain his ends." Unquote. Later in that piece, Wallace describes how fascist tendencies arise in a society. Quote, "The symptoms of fascist thinking are colored by environment and adapted to immediate circumstances, but always and everywhere they can be identified by their appeal to prejudice and by the desire to play upon the fears and vanities of different groups in order to gain power. It is no coincidence that the growth of modern tyrants has in every case been heralded by the growth of prejudice." Unquote. Is there a better description of our current predicament? I think not. Henry Wallace lived in times of intense uncertainty in our country, from the Great Depression through the fascist rise that led to World War II to the nuclear threats of the Cold War. He was a tremendous leader, a courageous visionary, and he understood how the noxious combination of money and power has long undermined democracy in this country. For Wallace, grassroots movements that could bring people together across divides and bold government action to address people's daily needs were the antidotes to fascism. We are once again in a time of great uncertainty, and many people are feeling quite helpless about this moment. Tonight, you will hear a message of hope that is focused on concrete strategies for building the solidarity and unity we need for a strong democracy. Speaking of hope, I'd like to pause here and note that thanks to the generosity of the Wallace Global Fund, we are hosting 12 Wallace Fellows this summer. They are college students and recent college grads, and I believe they represent the best of the next generation of social justice public scholars. Wallace Fellows, please stand. Let's give them a hand. Looking nice. I like it. I'm incredibly proud of the panel that we have assembled to address these topics. With us today is Soma Arias, who serves as the Executive Director of People's Action, where she brings over 20 years of organizing experience on issues such as immigrant rights, voting rights, and economic justice. She's also a board member of IPS. It's lovely to have her here. Also joining us is Erica Smiley, who serves as the Executive Director of Jobs with Justice, for which she has been organizing for 15 years. She is co-author with Srita Gupta of The Future We Need, Organizing for a Better Democracy in the 21st Century. Hear, hear. They have both developed strategies to respond to this precarious moment, and I'm looking forward to speaking with both of them. I'd also like to introduce John Nichols. He is a national affairs correspondent for The Nation and the author of many books, including The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, an appropriate title in these days, The Enduring Legacy of Henry Wallace's Anti-Fascist, Anti-Racist Politics. He's going to start us off by talking a bit about Wallace's legacy, and then he'll join us for a conversation. But before then, I want to say that for those of you in the audience, if you have questions you'd like to ask during the conversation, please write them on note cards that I think Ashley, my colleague, has. Yes, shout out to Ashley. So that or note cards, she'll get them to me. We'll answer those questions as well. Before we start our program, I would like to invite a member of the Wallace family to the podium to say a few words. Scott Wallace is a founding partner of the Democracy Alliance and co-chair of the Wallace Global Fund, and a longtime friend of IPS. Thank you so much, Scott.
Thank you, Tope. This is a great thrill for me. This is a great turnout, and we spent the afternoon with the fellows today. I'm so impressed, so thrilled at what you all have put together, the impressive group of young people who I think are going to be the change makers of the future. Students today, mentors tomorrow, leaders after that. So we're very proud of them. I would quote, with regard to what our foundation does in funding movements, Gandhi behind me. When change happens, first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, then you win. So Tope mentioned the American Fascist speech of my grandfather. That's what guides our foundation in the work that we do everywhere, building movements, the struggle between the common man, from his speech, The Century of the Common Man, and the American fascists, the unholy combination of corporate power and government power. And that struggle was never more relevant than yesterday. And we have a lot of work to do, but a lot of promise. This is such an important moment in the struggle between the common man and American fascism. And I just couldn't be more excited about the renewal that we're about to go through and our chances of beating back the tide that my grandfather devoted his life to fighting against. Corporate power and government power merged to oppress the common man. So I look forward to this the discussion. John Nichols knows more about my grandfather than I do. And we had a great discussion this afternoon. So I'll turn it back to you, and welcome to all, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Scott. Really appreciate it. John, would you like to say a few words about what you've been up to recently?
Fast test. Is this working good?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you know, I went over to Milwaukee to see the Republican convention. And that was something, let me tell you. And then I thought, well, at least I'll have a quiet weekend. And well, things happened. And then I thought, well, what a lucky person I am to be able to come to Washington, D.C. and to talk a little about Henry Wallace. And I thought, well, boy, if we could get 15, 20 people out for that, I'd be thrilled, because Henry Wallace has been so written out of our history that it's sometimes tough to get a crowd. And then look at you. And so what I've been up to right now is feeling very, very good about everybody who showed up here tonight to talk about the relevance of Henry Wallace to the 21st century. So why is this Iowa farmer, born in a little farmhouse near Orient, Iowa? I've been down that country road. I got a speeding ticket going to Henry Wallace's house because I was so excited. And I'm not kidding. I actually did. But why is this guy born out in the middle of Iowa so relevant to today, right? Because we've been told, we're often told this, right? Some historical figure matters to now. And then when you hear the story, it's a little confusing, because they don't really matter, except maybe something they did wrong. Henry Wallace is the guy who actually did something right. And the only way I can explain it is by taking you back 80 years ago tonight. 80 years ago this week. Because 80 years ago this week, you saw the play out of that article that you read. That article appeared in the New York Times, I think in April of 1944. Henry Wallace was the Vice President of the United States. Second most powerful person in the country by some measures. The person who was first in line of succession to the presidency. And he was already understood as a radical. Now, there have been many times when we've had somebody understood as a radical in the vice presidency of the United States, certainly not in the modern era, right? This country founded in opposition to colonialism has very much forgotten about that, except for Henry Wallace. Here he is in the 1940s, speaking out against imperialism, getting Winston Churchill so mad at him that Winston Churchill would literally spit when he talked about him. Because Henry Wallace said, yeah, we are fighting against fascism right now in World War II, but when this gets done, we got to fight against colonialism. We have to make sure that our allies in this war end their colonial oppression of countries in Africa and Asia and around the world. That did not make him popular. But he was also saying, I'm not just looking at the world. I'm looking here at the United States of America. And what I see in the United States of America is Jim Crow segregation. What I see in the United States of America is discrimination against Latinx people. What I see in America is a denial of the role of women in not just our society, but in winning this war. He talked about all of that. And when something went awry, he refused to look away. As Vice President of the United States in 1943, there was what was referred to in those days as a race riot in Detroit, Michigan. What had happened is that A. Philip Randolph, who we should always remember, we should have a night like this for A. Philip Randolph, the great labor organizer, still the most relevant labor organizers in many ways, in my view. A. Philip Randolph went to Franklin Roosevelt. He said, hey, Franklin, they talk like that. President of the United States would say, Phil. A. Philip Randolph, born in Jim Crow South, raised in Florida, came up to New York, figured out how will I speak to power. He got a job, I believe it was at the Yale Club, and learned how to imitate their accents. So he could speak like somebody who'd gone to Harvard or Yale. So when he sat down with Roosevelt, Roosevelt asked, what year were you at Harvard? But A. Philip Randolph got his education on the streets. And one of the things that he knew is that you had to have power. You had to confront at the critical juncture. And so A. Philip Randolph had said in 1940, 1941, we're going to have this war against fascism. We have to integrate the defense industries. Working people have to be on those lines to build the arsenal of democracy. You can't leave out black people. You can't leave out Latinx people. You can't leave out Asian America. You can't leave out the people who we need, their genius, their energy, their power. And so they integrated the war industries. That did not go over well in some places. And they had what were called race riots, but they weren't race riots. They were really attacks, in this case on black people, who had come into the factories, come into these northern cities. And it was awful what happened in Detroit. And all of the people in power wanted to look away, right? It's during World War II. They said, let's not talk about that. We have to pay attention to the war. Henry Wallace chartered a plane and flew to Detroit. And he said, I want the UAW to organize a big meeting. I want to have thousands of people there. And they got him out. And he said in that speech, you know, we keep talking about fighting against hatred and fascism and all this stuff overseas in Europe. I want to tell you, race hatred in this country is about the same stuff that we are fighting against overseas. That did not win a lot of applause. The New York Times said, why are you talking like this, right? And they actually, that's the genesis of the article. I tell the story because that's the genesis of the article. The New York Times said, you keep talking about American fascism. Will you write an article on this for us? Seemed very polite. They put it in the New York Times Magazine. What was not mentioned is the day it appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the New York Times editorial page condemned Henry Wallace for writing it. They literally did. So Wallace wrote some crazy stuff in our paper today. This was part of an effort to get rid of Henry Wallace as Vice President of the United States. In fact, a critical turning point, speaking at that rally, writing that piece. And there was a concerted effort by people who wanted to keep Jim Crow in the South, people who wanted to go back to a pre-New Deal vision of America. Within the Democratic Party, these people were. And they knew that the way to do it was because the choice of vice president in 1944, 80 years ago this week, would decide the future of the United States. Why? And I know this is going to seem crazy to you. You've never heard of something like this. It's beyond your comprehension. The United States had an aging and ailing president.
I don't believe it.
I know, it's hard to imagine. And the aging and ailing president was actually beloved. He was thought of as a very good person who had done a lot of good work. And there was this sense of, well, how do we handle this? How do we respond to this? And in that day, they said, well, we can't move him out of office. He's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You can't move him out of office. But we can pick the vice president because he's probably going to die in his next term. So let's put somebody safe in there as vice president. And so the campaign arose to remove Henry Wallace. And I could tell you 1,000 stories about Henry Wallace. We could be here till sometime after the election. Now, I know many of you will say, hey, Mr. Nichols, if you're promising me a chance to avoid looking at this car wreck, but it's not going to be a car wreck because we actually have the possibility of a transformational campaign in this election. So I'm going to circle around just this one thing rather than keeping you at it all night, and then we're going to bring the smart people in. But let me tell you this. They got to that convention in 1944, and Henry Wallace had done something that most people don't understand. He organized. He went out across the country. He paid for a tour of his own. He spoke in union halls and in black churches and in the basements of the buildings where Latinx workers were organizing in Colorado and in Texas and places like that. He went among the women in the defense factories and talked to them. And he said, we are in a fight right now. And at the end of this war, everything about your future is going to be decided. Will you have to go back home and your job be taken away from you because you saved us in the war, but we're not going to give you a job after that war? Will we recognize that the fascism overseas also has its embodiment here? Will we take down Jim Crow? He went across the country and he talked about that, and people came to that convention in Chicago, and they said, well, Henry Wallace, you're the vice president of the United States, but we're not going to let you speak. Not going to let you speak at the convention. And he said, why is that? And he said, well, you know, it's just very busy. We got the governor of Georgia speaking or something like that. So the bosses, the Southern segregationists, everybody said, we're not going to let you speak. Wallace finagled, and he pushed. They finally let him do the seconding speech for Franklin Roosevelt. Not the dominating speech, the seconding speech, where everyone goes to the bathroom. Right? I mean, but here comes Henry Wallace out there. He came to Chicago on his own. He carried his own bag from the station to the hotel. he didn't have a big retinue around him and stuff like that. Time came for his speech. And he got up there and he said, you know, a lot of people have been saying to me that I should probably be a little cautious here because there's a little debate about my future. He said, you know, just a few things I want to say to you. If we're going to be a fighting liberal party for the future of this country, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said, first and foremost, we got to end Jim Crow. We got to end the poll tax. We have to end discrimination. We have to end racism. We have to end sexism. We've got to trust our women, trust our workers, trust our... And he started going down the list and speaking again and again and again about every group that the people in power didn't want to have in the circle. And a weird thing happened. The people in that hall actually realized why they were Democrats. That happens very rarely. And they said there were old Democrats with tears rolling down their face. And they started cheering for Henry Wallace. And the bosses, the segregationists, the corporate people who had come in to stop him, they started, you know, getting crazy. This is bad. Because if somebody got to that microphone and said, I move acclamation, let's renominate our winning ticket of Franklin Roosevelt and Henry Wallace, that hall would have said yes, and it would have been done. And so Claude Pepper, some of you are old enough to remember this, Claude Pepper, who was the anti-racist, well, he was imperfect. I'm not going to make him quite as good as I wish I could make him better. But he was he was a better senator from Florida than a lot of senators from Florida in that period. You can understand, he had some inclinations. He was curious, yes. And so he decided, as a big supporter of Wallace, he knew the future that was at stake. He decided, as many Southerners did in that day, they knew that if Wallace went down, they were not going to have any ally, right? And so he started running toward the podium. And he had the railroad trainmen, which is members of a tough union, with him because the unions loved Wallace. And they started going for that podium. They were going to go up the steps, get that microphone, and move for acclamation. And the boss of Pittsburgh was running the podium. And he had a bunch of thugs up there. And he said, stop them, right? There was a fight on those steps. They were literally pushing and pulling. This wasn't some sort of like boring, you know, like, oh, let's tune in CNN and see what happened at the convention tonight. This was the real thing. This was a battle for power. And Pepper, who's about 5 feet tall, he's like banging his way up, and he says he's got his foot almost to the top step. Almost to the top step. And the boss of the convention yelled to the guy at the podium, shut it down. And the guy at the podium, at the microphone, says, I hear a motion to adjourn. The crowd roared, no. The loudest no you have ever heard in the history of American politics. And the chairman of the convention said, I hear a vote of acclamation for shutting down the convention. Never heard of something like that happening before. And they shut it down. That night, all the corporate types, all the segregationists, everybody moved into power to stop Henry Wallace. They said more people were promised postmasterships and ambassadorships that night than on any night in the history of the country. They then reprinted the tickets so the people who were in the hall the day before, their tickets wouldn't work to get them in the hall the next day. The next day, they reconvened and had the vote for vice president. On the first ballot, Henry Wallace still won, but he didn't win enough. So they had to have a second ballot and a third. As they went along, more people became postmasters, more people became ambassadors, and slowly but surely they ticked it away, and they took that nomination away from Henry Wallace. And when that war ended, and when Franklin Roosevelt died in April, just weeks after he began his fourth term, when he died, Henry Wallace did not become president of the United States. And the point that I would give, and I'll close with this, is this country lost an amazing opportunity. Henry Wallace wasn't perfect. There's people who criticize him. I, in my book, point out failures and flaws of the man. But the fact of the matter is that America had an opportunity in that moment to end the war in Europe and to come home and say, we want to fight against American fascism. And we identify American fascism as racism, sexism, classism, and all of the isms that stand in the way of this country being what it ought to be. And because of that, the Democratic Party, not the Republican Party, the Democratic Party delayed the future by generations. And so we gather tonight to talk a little bit about this past, but also to talk about how we are going to avoid delaying the future for more generations, and how we are going to assure that 2024 is the year that we undo the damage of 1944 and bring this country toward a place of economic and social and racial justice, where we save the planet and where we believe in diplomacy and anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism and peace as the future for this world. Solidarity, brothers and sisters.
Thank you so much for those riveting comments. I don't know a better advertisement for your book than what you just said, so please.
Makes a fine holiday gift.
Exactly, indeed. Incredibly compelling words. Thank you, John, for that. I want to turn to this panel and let's have a conversation. Soma, you're ED of People's Action. You lead an organization that pulls together statewide groups all over the country. Many of those groups are organizing in rural areas, and you've lived in Kansas. I'm from Utah, so I can relate a little bit. A predominantly white rural state. First of all, could you tell us, I've heard a lot about deep canvassing, and a lot of people talk about it. Could you talk a little bit about what you're actually doing in these rural areas and why it's so effective?
Yeah, thank you. It's so great to be here tonight. It's been an exciting 24 hours, and I really wanted to be in as many spaces as I can to celebrate with people like yourselves. And I took a train quickly from Pennsylvania, where we're doing some very important work to be here, so I'm so excited.
We're so grateful.
So I'm an immigrant from El Salvador who, by no choice of my own, ended up in Kansas. But I was here 7 years, and I choose to go back to Kansas because I think in 2016, after the night of the election, I called some directors and some people I knew in states like Nebraska, Kansas, the middle of the country, and I said, I think the rest of the country is now going to experience what we have been experiencing in places like Kansas over the next the next 4 years, and we did. I do want to say, because organizing in rural is in rural and small towns is really the essence of organizing. I was homeschooling. I was a devoted Christian, evangelical Christian. In 1999, I was homeschooling my 3 daughters, and an organizer who was a trainee of Shell Trapp, the co-founder of People's Action, knocked on my door, and I sent her away. She came back a second time, and I said, I don't have time. I have 3 small children. I was homeschooling because I was such a devoted conservative Christian. I did not want to send my kids to public school. And that is the type of, so I was homeschooling. But she kept coming back, and eventually she got me to go with her door knocking, and she got me into organizing. And I discovered in organizing that it wasn't much different than what I was doing in church building. And because a woman, a white Quaker woman from Kansas, did not give up on this immigrant woman who couldn't be any more different, I am here today, 23 years later.
Wow. Wow.
So to me, that is the power of small town organizing and the work that can be done when you don't give up on people, when you understand that organizing is about bringing different people together to find their self-interest, and that they can drive and see the win together. But it's also important to recognize that we have been through COVID. It hasn't been too long. But even before COVID, the ability to be able to relate to another human being, to actually engage in a conversation, is in the downfall, is in the decline. We are suffering from the inability to be able to connect to people, and COVID made that a lot worse for organizers. So in 2022, when I came on to, in 2020 actually is when we first started actually taking the tactic of what we call deep canvas, which is actually meaningful transformational conversations with people who may not agree with you. And we have a discipline of training. In 2020, we trained over 23,000 people to have over 280,000 conversations. 280,000 conversations. And So that, I mean, and then it wasn't like the thing about organizing, we know it works, but it cannot be tested, right? The beauty with Deep Canvas is that we actually run a study of the 280,000. So we had to prove that we could move people from where they were to move them, and we actually got them to vote for Biden in 2020. 280,000 conversations, and guess what? We're gonna double it in 2024. But just, so that is Deep Canvas. Deep Canvas is a tool in an organizing tool, but at the essence of organizing, it's really about being able to connect to people. It's about meeting people where they're at. And the uniqueness about organizing in small towns and rural towns is this, guess what? That you can have an enemy, you can have a target in organizing, but you're gonna see them at the bar later, so you have to treat them like a human being.
Yeah.
There is a place in Wichita, Kansas, that we call Mords, and my husband loves to spend a lot of time there, more than I would like sometimes. But that place is unique in the heartland of America because you share tables, and you are forced, if you like the place and you like the music, you go and you sit people that you don't know because there's a sign that says we share tables, and it's a very unique place. But that is what organizing in rural towns means, is that you have to be able to see other people as human beings and to connect to them, and you have to be curious, which is a technique of Deep Canvas, which is a tactic, right? So that is what it means, and that's how I'm here. That's why I believe in it. So that for us is like we're committed to organizing, and because of that type of organizing, places like Kansas was one of the first states in the nation to pass in-state tuition for undocumented immigrants and still have it. And we continue to have it each year. But there are other places like in the middle of the country in Tennessee, which I know you're going to talk about, but there are places in Nebraska and other places which this is what happens. But as an organizer, you have to be able to find the self-interest in people, and this is what we train, which is why we're last year we launched what we call an organizing revival, which is a commitment by our entire network of 39 affiliates in 30 states to double down in their membership and to double down on the training of organizing and the transformational tools of organizing. So that's why I believe in it, because I'm here because of organizing.
Hear, hear. Thank you so much for that. Really wonderful. Smiley, I want to bring you into this. You lead Jobs with Justice, and you have argued that black workers in the South and unions overall are a key force for countering rising authoritarianism and fascism.
I have argued that, yes.
You've argued that very eloquently. Why do you believe black workers play such an important role in countering fascism?
I mean, well, we could be here till the next election, but I will try to be succinct. And I'm gonna respond to your question as opposed to answering it, as I've been trained to do. The first thing I want to say, it's such an honor to be on this stage with all of you. And whatever, I'm just going to leave it there. Secondly, after Selma's point about what it looks like in the middle of the country is often different than what you imagine it. Now, Sarita Gupta and I wrote a book called The Future We Need, also a great holiday gift. Have a copy for some of you here. I'm going to bring yours. I got it. But in it, we describe this new map. And I want to bring up this concept because instead of looking at the country through the lens of, say, which presidential candidate a state or a county voted for, we think it's actually more important to look at it through the lens of who has access to, say, 20th century versions of democracy, whether that's voting or organizing collective bargaining. If you think of democracy as the majority being able to weigh in and set decisions for whatever the universe is, who has access to that, who recently lost it, who never had it? Because you find that there's actually an appetite for some of those places that never had it in the middle and south of the country that's for something far better than what we currently have today. And this was never supposed to be like a chapter in our book. It happened when I was talking to some of the teachers that walked out in West Virginia in 2018. And I had this huge assumption that it was like, Morganton and Charleston, like they were all the first ones that went out. But it was some of the three most conservative political counties at the bottom of that state that walked out first. Right. That's who walked out. And if you looked at the country If you looked at the state just through the political map, you would have missed that. You would never knock the doors there, right? And so I think the same is true for black people. So let's just, some facts, right? So the majority of black people still live in the southern United States, okay? And if we're having a conversation here about fascism, we have to understand what American fascism is. Now, John's been very diplomatic by calling it, you know, Jim Crow and all the isms. We should call it what it is. It's the Confederacy and their descendants. That's American fascism. And they are still alive, right? And so, you know, I say this because, as you exposed, I like to think and argue that Southern black workers are key to fighting fascism. And it's so funny because I was talking to some people about this, some very important people with very, you know, big social media followings and lots of big pocketbooks and stuff. And they said, you know, like you keep talking about the South and you want us to go to like South Carolina and Tennessee and Alabama, you want us to invest in these places, but like, I mean, it's a great idea. This, you know, it's beautiful, and I love your vision for industrial democracy, which I'll share in a second, of course, because I have the mic. And, but yeah, don't you think it's just like, maybe are you biting off more than you can chew? Like, maybe you're in over your heads, you know? Like, it's a great idea. Love it. I'm behind it. But are you the right? Yeah, it's just really big. And, you know, I say, yeah. Are we in over our heads? Yeah, probably. You know, like, was like Harriet Tubman in over her head when she dragged people across the river just to say the freedom? I don't know. I mean, was like A. Philip Randolph in over his head when he asked for the GI Bill? What, Ella Bacon over her head? Is Kamala Harris in over her head? I mean, who didn't win anything who wasn't in over their freaking head? So yes, I think we might be in over our heads in a great way, and thank God. And I want to speak to, again, I'm here to talk about black people in the South, but really, Tope, I'm going to take liberties and talk about democracy.
Please.
In particular, the opposition to fascism. And I particularly want to talk about small d democracy because we witnessed some of it last night. So I've spent the last week in North Carolina, which is where I'm from, and I pretty much like to assert that whatever room I'm in, for reasons I still don't fully understand, even though I haven't lived there in 30 years. I live in New Jersey, but nevertheless, I was there with my family, and I got to watch some of this unfold because we saw these kind of, you know, Democratic Party leaders, you know, holding the line. I've been there. I know you got to do what you got to do. We stick with him. He's going to win. He's the one who can do it. Bless their hearts. And then they would interview the rank and file Democrats registered across the state, particularly black folks, and they would just be like, oh, you know, like we love him. Like he's so great. He's nice. But really, like they just wanted to say he should take a nap. But in North Carolina code, that comes across as, you know, he's so sweet, you know, and he did such a good job, but, you know. And then they say, well, would you support Harris? Yes. Okay. I saw what was happening. I saw it start to unfold, and I'd like to say a little bit about my mother, who is kind of my source on the streets. Like, she's not necessarily an activist or a movement person, but she's like, you know, a black woman living in North Carolina who happens to be a part of the same sorority as Vice President Harris. Anyway, and I saw that switch real quick. And one of the things we saw last night, like where they went from you know, toting the line to like, nope, something's got to change. And what I feel like we saw was not just a victory of Democratic leaders and, you know, in all their beauty and flaws, but what we saw was a victory of democracy, small d democracy of a Democratic base in action. Because the first states to move their delegates last night, right? Tennessee, South Carolina, North Carolina. Now, North Carolina, of course, you know, we can't just come clean. We got to be like, and we want to tell you who you need to put as your vice president, who happens to be our governor. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. But my point is, it was small d democracy with people coming together in the nth hour. 700 people, 800 people coming together as delegates to say what they wanted to do and say, oh, well, you should have an active convention. That's what they're doing. If you think like an actual Democratic convention means coming to make a decision in 3 days in Chicago, That's actually not a convention. What they did was more like a constitutional convention, like in the state, where real people were actually looking each other in the face and making decisions. And that's what democracy is. And I want to draw this back to why I call democracy, American democracy, a descendant of Confederacy, right? Because when we think about democracy, we have to think a little bit about, and what I like to think about it is Reconstruction, right? Because when we think about Reconstruction, what we're doing, we're reconstructing democracy. And in fact, even in the 1860s, what they said was we are trying to integrate a formerly enslaved workforce into a multiracial democracy. They used those words even in the 1860s, right? And so when they look at the Reconstruction amendments, the first Reconstruction amendment to reconstruct democracy was the 13th Amendment. It was a labor amendment. And then you have the 14th, which starts to define citizenship and due process. And then you have the 15th, which starts to define suffrage. But those were the pillars of democracy. And over the last century and a half, we've been trying to expand and actualize those principles of democracy, while our opposition has been trying to roll them back. Project 2025 is a rollback to pre-1865, to be clear. And so one of the key things that we feel like even we have some self-criticism as a movement, right? That we have emphasized voting, which is important, right? Like people died. My ancestors died getting the right to vote. But to our peril, we ignored the other amendments, particularly the labor amendment, right? Because as soon as we allowed that to roll back, we may not have had slavery as we remember it in the past, but we certainly had forced labor, whether it was in prison labor, whether it was low-wage labor. Today, I think the Alabama governor called it the Alabama discount. Henry McMaster's in his State of the State in January, just this year, declared big labor unions the clear and present danger of the state, right? And we'll talk about why in terms of the shift in industry, but like the key thing I want to say here is that without that piece, with that side of the coin, not the corn, Lord help us, there's a lot of sides of corn, but without that side of the coin being represented in our fight to democracy, the political democracy will never stand, right? And so I like to say at Jobs with Justice, we're not just a worker organization, we are a labor organization. We're not just a worker and a labor organization, we are a democracy organization. It's just that labor and organizing collective bargaining is our lane to build democracy. Just like Soma is fighting to do deep canvas to get people out to vote, we're fighting to expand workers' participation in standard setting in their workplaces, in other employer and economic relationships that democracy requires, small d democracy requires everyday people to come together in whatever universe and situation that they're in, to be able to set standards for that universe in a way that everyone gets a chance at participation, just like what Soma was describing. So to your point as to why then Southern black workers in this context, why are they key to this? Well, the first thing I want to say is, the first part of winning a war is knowing you're in one. And we have been in what I would call, or what one of my mentors would call, a cold version of the Civil War for many, many years. And we've been fighting against the descendants of the Confederacy, we, the descendants of Reconstructors, right? That's the war that we're in. That's why the governors of South Carolina and Tennessee and Alabama came together to put out a statement against the UAW when they started winning at Volkswagen. That's why they put it out. They put it out because as manufacturing begins to shift to the South, as auto workers begin to take auto companies begin to take federal investments to move to South Carolina. And let me just be clear, right? I'm not just talking general. You got Oshkosh making the electric fleet for the Postal Service move from Union, Wisconsin, South Carolina. Proterra, which makes the fleet for many city buses moving from Los Angeles, South Carolina. Arrival, making the electric fleet for UPS, United Parcel Service, moving from the UK, South Carolina. Following all these firms from around the world who had been moving to the southern United States, like Hyundai, Toyota, Nissan, in order to take advantage of the southern political economy. I just want to be clear. And it's not just, I know you're going to try to cut me off, bless you. Just bear with me 1 second, because,
I would never do such a thing.
You have the southern person talking, you got to add like on either side. But I just want to say, right, but like all of these industries, and I mentioned manufacturing. Manufacturing is the #1 employer of black men in the South, right? And so if we're going to have democracy, we've already established that we have to have democracy that's also economic democracy, where decision-making happens by a majority in our economic settings, right? If we're going to have economic democracy, we have to have it in the place where industry is moving. In this case, to the southern United States. It's been moving to the southern United States, right? And you've got states like Texas, 9th largest economy in the world. You can't ignore Texas, right? How are you going to ignore Texas? If you just look at the political map, it's easy to ignore. But if you look at political economy, it's impossible to ignore, right? And so through that lens, the idea of taking advantage of the increase in manufacturing and the political momentum that we're beginning to see even just in the last 24 hours, the key thing that all of us need to be thinking about is how are we going to take advantage of this moment, not just to ensure everybody votes where they can, right? But to actually ensure that the systems of decision-making overall get democratized, that people can have a say in setting standards, and not just with their employer through collective bargaining, although that's part of it, but at the level of industry, at the level of labor markets. Like the Biden administration, to their credit, put more investment into the private economy than FDR, even when adjusted to inflation. But let's not make the same mistake in compromising out the small d democracy when it comes to our economic lives. This is a moment for us to actually have to truly reconstruct democracy in the United States against fascism, or in our case, the descendants of the Confederacy.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. Thank you so much for those fantastic comments. I think we're going to pivot to questions from the audience now. And I will read the first one. And I think Ashley's coming up with some more. To call you out, Ashley. All right, let's see what we can do. And we'll get to as many as we can. Okay. Cool. Let's see, how do we influence the establishment Democratic majority to hold and act on progressive values such as anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and structural reform of government and systems, especially in the face of fascism? That is a mouthful and a really naughty question as well. I wonder who wants to take that on.
Not too naughty, actually.
Okay.
I mean, because there are not copies of my book here, so you can't buy it, I can promote its subtitle, which is that, the basic concept is fight for the soul of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, in my view, I wrote that book because I was trying to figure out Trump. And in trying to figure out Trump, I thought, well, I'll write about the Republican Party, right? And how it kind of became kind of Confederate. But then I realized that's an absurd thing to write about. No, you write about the Democratic Party because you're trying to figure out how the Democratic Party could lose to this, right? And also where did they fail along the way? And my argument is that the failure of the Democratic Party again and again and again is to listen to its left. Not because its left is all my friends, but because its left actually has the dynamic ideas for the future, right? And these ideas of economic and social and racial justice, save the planet, have future peace rather than war. These are ideas that resonate with people. Yeah. And I will get to the core of your question in one sec, but let me just tell you, I went to that Republican convention. And I was there, and I heard J.D. Vance get up there, who's, by the way, from Ohio, not from Kentucky.
Bashir made that clear this morning. I don't know if you saw his comments, but that was...
I'm just making that point, and I know, yeah, but this is the thing. J.D. Vance got up at that convention, and he said, he's talking about Biden, because they thought they were running against Biden still. Because when you have a cult of personality, you cannot imagine that the personality at the top would leave, right? And so to them, the idea that Biden would leave was foreign, and so they kept running their convention against Biden, despite all evidence that that was not where the campaign was going to end up. But J.D. Vance is going after Biden, and he says, Biden, he voted for NAFTA. And then they closed our factories. Then he voted for China free trade, and they closed our factories. Then he voted for that war in Iraq, And after they closed our factories and we didn't have any jobs for our young people, they sent our young people off to fight in that war that didn't need to happen. Now this is a right-wing Republican saying, like, bad free trade policies, bad economics, and bad foreign policy, bad militarism, that's the problem. Well, if a Republican is saying that, cynically, but if a Republican is saying that, why wouldn't the Democratic Party be saying that? Well, this is my core challenge here. And what I will tell you is that power within the Democratic Party is always organized, and it is always thinking about how it can maintain power, 24/7, all the time. Progressives, we kind of organize every cycle. Now you guys, you're saving us, right? You're going to change that, and you're going to talk about it. But what I'm going to tell you is, historically, the problem is, well, we got a campaign going. We're going to work for this candidate, or we're going to do that, and then the campaign doesn't quite succeed, does great, but then we let it fade, right? And then we reorganize again. Jesse Jackson, Bernie Sanders, right? We keep coming back. And what I would tell you is, power loves that, because power says, well, they're going to all go home and go to work and do other things. The left, the progressives, have to understand that they are in a permanent struggle for the soul of the Democratic Party. If they do not understand that permanent struggle, day in, day out, then we will be on this repeat cycle. And the last thing I'll tell you, about half of my book's about Henry Wallace, about half about it is this fight for the soul of the Democratic Party. And I will tell you how power in the Democratic Party sometimes operates. When the left actually succeeds, as they did when nominating a World War II hero, an incredibly noble man, one of the most decent men ever nominated for President of the United States, George McGovern, in 1972. You know what they did? They formed Democrats for Nixon. They literally had governors and senators and other people campaigning against their own nominee, because we're not going to let that happen, right? And so that's how real this struggle is. If you understand it as such and you take it seriously, the ideas of progressives are better for winning elections. And so bottom line is, it is a fight for the soul of the Democratic Party. You got to take it seriously. If you don't take it seriously, we're on that repeat cycle forever.
Well said. Soma, I was wondering if you had any sort of response to that, or?
Yeah, I do. I haven't published a book, but we did write The Antidote to Authoritarianism, which is, it's a white paper that we published together with national networks that really puts organizing back at the center. And the reason it's interesting just watching what's happened the last 24 hours, that there's this excitement, and at the same time, people, especially people of color in this country, and a lot of us don't believe, like there's doubt that a woman of color can win in this moment. And even though we're all excited, there is that fear that they keep bringing it back. And so I think the takeaway for me out of this conversation, and out of the last 6 months of the conversation that we've been having with the affiliates and leaders from, like, we gotta believe that that we can govern, but we've never seen it, right? So just look at, like, even in this conversation, thinking about the Biden administration and actually us doing power analysis with our leaders who are working 6 or 7 days a week. Like, how do you translate and how do you use popular education to actually, when you organize and you tell the story about what we've accomplished? This administration has the most diverse cabinet in the history, right? And so sometimes, and look at we're gonna do a live stream next week with the PCP. And we're going to talk about the fact that, yeah, we haven't gotten everything we want with years of fighting, but we've gotten a lot. And that is what governing is about, looking at the long term and really understanding that we can win small things. We're not going to win it all, but we've come a long ways. And if we don't organize, we could lose it, which is why this moment is exciting. It's exciting. But also the doubt and the fear that we may not win, and that the woman of color is there, and that's probably the biggest thing that we're going to have to have the challenge with our own community, that maybe thinks maybe we can't win, and we're going to prove that we can, and that's why organizing is the antidote.
Can I just
started as like a German workers' party, even with like a semi-socialist bent to it that was racist AF. And, you know, right, anti-Semitic, right? Like, it was basically saying all the right things minus the fact, for us, but not for them. Like, they need to, I don't know, work, die, whatever, go away. Whereas, like, we need to stand up against the bosses, even though many of them were the bosses. That's actually what's happening. When we talk about American fascism, that is the base of Trump and Vance at this moment. People who are screwed, people who feel like they should, who technically should be aligned with our interests, who, because of white supremacy, aren't seeing our shared enemies, right? And someone asked me, who's going to win Michigan? Which of the candidates that are going to win? I said, whoever aligns with working people against their boss, landlord, or banker is going to win in whatever race it is. And that's just the bottom line. And that should tell you all you need to know about democracy, not just being about a political vote.
Lovely. I just want to note that we're past the hour. This has been an incredible conversation. In lieu of any more questions, I just want to ask if any of you have any final comments you'd like to offer before we close this out. Sure, yeah. Very quick,
You really want to
but
open it up
okay.
like that? You don't want to? Okay.
Any sort of summary final comments that might come to mind?
I'm going to give you the last word because you're so eloquent. Like, one of you should really take the last word. But I will want to say, one of my mentors once said that if we claim democracy, but people know from their day-to-day experience that that's not real, that when they clock in, that their constitution goes out the door when they clock into work, or that when they vote, you know, the state's so gerrymandered it doesn't necessarily matter. If we claim that as a democracy, but the experience of people isn't democracy, then they won't fight for it. But if we actually acknowledge the flaws in the democracy, economic and political, and if we create a vision that we can all see ourselves in, to set standards, to have our voices heard, even in what may seem like the smallest decisions at work and in our communities, then we're creating a vision that everyone can see ourselves in, and then we can actually create and imagine a movement for democracy worth fighting for. And I think in the last 24 hours since I got back from North Carolina yesterday, and I drove down from Philadelphia this morning, and I've had all the emotions in the last 24 hours, because I'm not, you know, I'm a Democrat in kind of name only as my personal identification, right? I'm a leftist. I've never, you know, identified in that way. But at the same time, what I recognized is that there's a movement happening. There's a movement moment happening. There is a vision for a democracy worth fighting for that millions of people are currently now imagining. And I can't not be a part of that. I can't not be a part of a fight for a democracy worth having. So it may not be the movement I tried to build. It may not be a call to action that I put out. But as people who believe in democracy and who are actively against fascism, as people who want to, let's say, even just choose who is going to be the easiest target in the coming 4 years, as people who want to actually see democracy expand beyond the voting booth and of course improved at the voting booth, but expand it beyond the voting booth to our work sites, to our industries, to our markets, we damn sure better get behind this movement moment and behind the people like my mom, who's not necessarily an activist, but unlike a week ago where she was, you know, just doing her thing and not necessarily planning on doing much right away for the election, is already volunteering and taking up assignments.
So I think just to close, there was a question that you were going to ask and you didn't get a chance to, but it's something about what can the progressive left do at this moment. And let me just say that earlier this month I was in El Salvador right before the election of Bukele, and fascism, democracy, most of the people that I talk to, like your mom, or the people that we talk to in our neighborhoods, and we cannot go to them and say, you gotta do this because you gotta save democracy, because that's not the conversation they're having. Like here or in El Salvador, they are talking about how much my aunt was telling me, well, my aunt who in 2016 and their family voted for Trump in Texas, Salvadorians from Texas voted for Trump. I couldn't understand why. So the conversation they are having is, I was talking about buying a stove, and my aunt was, well, you better buy it now because you may not be able to buy it if Biden wins. That is the conversation that they are having. They are talking about they're talking about the price of groceries and blaming Biden. So the thing that we could be doing right now is get out from under our silos, get out from under our progressive conversation, and actually go to the ground and do the work of talking to people. But being connected to people, I think, is the most important thing that we could do at this moment, because I experienced the same thing here in El Salvador, where in El Salvador it's all about safety, it's about economy, and the people there, just like the people here, would vote against their self-interest because they're scared, because they believe the lies, and because, I mean, in El Salvador, the average salary a month, it's about $300 a month, and people under Bukele maybe feel safer, but they don't have, their life isn't better off. And so the conversations we need to be having with people in this moment is about we got to get personal, and we got to be talking about what impacts them. So I'm going to make a pitch before I turn it over to you. People's Action is opening opportunities to volunteer. We can train you on how you can talk to people about everyday issues and issues that matter to them. So, and we need to, with this year, we're going to train 43,000 volunteers, and we're going to make 530,000 conversations, more than 1 million conversations. So we need each and every one. If you don't have a home to do this and to be trained, come to People's Action. We can train you how to have conversations. That's what we need to be doing in this moment.
Many years ago, I got invited to address People's Action Missouri at one of their gatherings. And before I spoke, they had a beautiful baby contest. And it's like all the moms brought their babies in. And I was like, well, this is interesting. I've never actually been the follow-up to a beautiful baby contest. And my friend George Gale said, we're organizing working moms who don't have a lot of money and don't have a lot of time. One of the things that makes them feel good is a beautiful baby contest. So with all due respect, the beautiful baby contest may be a little more important than your speech. and I think that's why People's Action, if you don't know this organization, I know everybody here probably does, but that's why you should be checking it out, because they actually try to figure out how to speak to people where they're at and bring them into this movement. So I honor you for your incredible work. And I don't even have to get started on these people, right? Because this vision of going into the South, that takes us right back to Henry Wallace. 1948, when Henry Wallace ran for president of the United States, uphill campaign, was not going to win that campaign. It became pretty clear pretty soon. So he could have just, gone on the media of his day, right? Kind of had his platform. No, he decided to get a caravan of cars and drive south. And he went to the southern United States in 1948 with a multiracial, multi-ethnic caravan of people, including sometimes Paul Robeson. And they went and they said, well, a couple rules here, simple rules in the segregated South, in the Confederate South, in the apartheid South. He said a couple rules. Number one, we will never, ever speak at a hall that doesn't allow black people and white people to stand together in the same place. Many towns in the South saw for the first time multiracial rallies for politics in Henry Wallace's campaign in 1948. They said, but it got tougher than that. They said, and we won't stay in hotels that won't let black people and white people stay in the same place. They slept in their cars. There are pictures of Henry Wallace, only 3.5 years away from being vice president of the United States, sitting in the back seat of his car, eating his food out of a box, because there was no restaurant in the town that was integrated, and Henry Wallace said, I won't eat in a segregated restaurant. That's who Henry Wallace was. And I will close off by... Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to my sister, who I put in the audience here to emphasize and put the exclamation mark on the importance of this. I love it that people are knowing this history. Let me just circle it around to this one core point, and that is my friend Kim Crenshaw taught me about intersectionality. And I should have known about it. Maybe I did in my heart, but I didn't in my mind, right? And I will tell you something. I'm not making endorsements. This is just, we are here talking about politics. I want to just say, it is my view that everything that Henry Wallace fought for in 1948 was for a future where a black woman who is the child of immigrants from Jamaica and from India could compete for the presidency of the United States of America. And I know there will be people who find their imperfections along the way and say, oh, well, this I don't like, or I don't approve of that, or maybe this and that and stuff like that. But I will tell you this. That when you have a woman who has come through what this woman has come through, and she is going to be the nominee of one of the two major parties in this country, I know we have so many reasons to feel hopeless. I know we have so many reasons to feel overpowered. But Henry Wallace, at the toughest times, never gave up on hope. And brothers and sisters, I believe we have reached the hopeful moment he dreamed of. Now, he just hands it off to us to carry that ball across the finish line. Thank you.
What? A beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much to this incredible panel. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. You guys have been amazing. Thanks to all of you for coming out. I want to make a very quick announcement before the end. I believe my colleague Phil has sent this up, but right here tomorrow at 6 p.m., there's a conversation that will be happening in advance of the protest of Netanyahu's speaking before Congress. So come out here tomorrow at 6 p.m. if you can. I want to give a shout out to the Wallace Global Fund. Thank you so much for all that you have done. We are so grateful to you. Thank you. Shout out to The Nation magazine, Busboys and Poets for hosting us, for letting us go a bit over. We appreciate it. Thank you. IPS staff, Tim Comfort, are you here? He's the new, please stand, director of the Fellows Program at IPS. Shout out to NETFA. NETFA, thank you. Wallace Fellows, the reason why we're here. Thank you for being here. And thanks to all of you for coming. Have a fantastic evening. Thank you so much.